各位朋友，你好，我是史东，再次的说一声谢谢您按时的收看以及收听我们八方论坛这个节目。我想最近呢，一定关心的事情呢，我想一定猜得出来，就是有关于中国和美国贸易的这个贸易战或者贸易协商的事情。那么最近呢几天呢，又有一些新的发展。我在今天节目里面呢，为你请到的是一位在这方面的专家，一位贵宾。那么我基本上在网络上、在电视上，首先发觉到她是一位华裔的女性，她是一位女的经济学者，她的名字叫做 Sara Hsu。她英文对她来讲是她的第一语言，所以说我们在今天节目中呢，对她的访问将会用英文进行。那么我把 Sara Hsu 很快的为您介绍一下，她是纽约州州立大学的经济系的副教授，她曾经是 Wellesley College 的学士，她的 PhD 呢是在这个 University of Utah 得到的。她写过很多书，都是有关经济的书，一共前后我算了一下有6本书。那么另外他还常写很多的专栏，这些专栏都是在全世界最有名的专业性的这个经济性的或者政治性的杂志中的出现，包括了 Diplomats， 包括了 Nikkei Asian Review， 包括了 East Asia Forum， 还有包括了 China Brief， 还有 China World， 以及很有名的 Forbes Magazine 等等都有他的专栏。那么现在呢，我就把我们今天的贵宾呢带到您的眼前。 Sarah，welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure and it's an honor. During my introduction, I told my audience how I discovered you from internet as well as on TV. I saw this very intelligent economy specialist or scholar that really impressed me, and I really appreciate you agreed to this interview today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. The first question I have for you, because the last time we have contact is about a week ago. Mm-hmm. I think it's almost a week ago, and things had developed a lot between China and U.S. trade. And the latest development, I'm using a report from AP, which says the U.S. and China combined, the potential tariffs on Beijing could cover $450 billion, which is the amount that U.S. government is trying to or going to or about to put a tariff on. And this is a sum equals to 89% of Chinese goods imported to the United States last year. So my question to you, Sarah, is an open-ended question. What is your take on all this thing?
Well, I think that it's a big mistake, and it reflects a lack of understanding on the part of President Trump about what the trade deficit is, as well as how to go about addressing intellectual property theft. Mm-hmm. I think on both counts, he's very wrong. And most economists would agree that free trade in general is a good thing, and tariffs and protectionism have been shown through history to be detrimental to economies. And this is really going to have a very negative impact, in particular on the United States and as well as on China and other countries. And one of the reasons that President Trump has given is to shrink the U.S. trade deficit with China, which was $566 billion last year. And this really is not something that makes sense. The trade relationship is not a win-lose relationship. It's considered, based on theory as well as in practice, a win-win situation. And the reason for this is that both countries should be able to gain from trade, both China and the U.S., as well as the U.S. and other European countries, Mexico, Canada. And so Donald Trump does not understand basic economics, which is a problem. The trade deficit reflects U.S. multinationals that go abroad and manufacture goods in China. It reflects China's strong position as a processing center in the Asian supply chain and global supply chains. And some economics group, I can't remember which, calculated that if we take into account the U.S. multinationals that do the processing in China, that the U.S.-China trade gap would actually be a surplus, which means that we would have a net benefit of sending money into China, and China would be sending more money to us. On the other hand, and so Donald Trump doesn't understand this. The trade deficit also reflects the fact that Chinese people, on average, make about 1/5 of the income that Americans make. They make about, on average, $11,000 per year, whereas in the U.S., the average GDP per capita, or average income per capita, is about $55,000 per year. So for Chinese consumers to be able to suddenly catch up to the U.S. and start to consume at the level that we do would require that their incomes rise by 5 times. And this is just something that is impossible to happen in a short period of time. So Donald Trump does not understand that. And he also says that he's imposing tariffs because there are intellectual property issues. Now, these are real issues in which U.S. firms doing business in China with other Chinese firms feel that sometimes Chinese firms kind of force them to hand over their intellectual property, usually verbally, so that there's nothing in writing. And so this is something that a lot of U.S. companies in China have brought to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in various places in China, and that the Chamber of Commerce has in turn brought to the U.S. government. And so the way that previous administrations, like the Obama administration, have dealt with this is to engage in talks with China to stop this practice. And so putting tariffs on the goods that these joint ventures produce with China and then probably export out to the U.S. is going to hit those same American firms twice in a negative way. And so on both reasons that President Trump has given for these tariffs, we just find that there's no economic sense behind them.
You mentioned Trump doesn't have a lot of economic sense, but what about his advisors, all these advisors he had around him? I mean, what do you say about that? I mean, it's just incredible.
Right. I think that he seems to have a division within his administration where some officials are really hawkish against China, and the other ones are very pro-business and free trade. So it seems like there's really a miscommunication within his administration and some basic misunderstandings about economics within his administration.
Mm-hmm. Give us a worst possible scenario if this thing goes on as the way it seems like the collision is going to take place.
Well, it's going to negatively impact U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers, as well as Chinese businesses and Chinese consumers. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because the consumers will face higher prices when they go to the store. So U.S. consumers who are going to Walmart will face higher prices, mm-hmm. and the same with Chinese consumers.
Let me interrupt you here. I'm very naive in this subject, so I'm looking for some answer. Let's say if U.S. is gonna put 25% tariff on Chinese import. Let's say it's those are consumer goods. It's going to end up, like you said, on the shelf of Walmart. Does that mean at least a consumer will see a 25% increase on the price they're buying their stuff?
That's
so
correct.
That's automatic, right? That's assuming the reseller is not adding any more profit on top of that.
Well, right. So assuming that everything else stays the same, which is something economists like to do, because otherwise it gets confusing for us, is, we say everything else being equal, the consumers will see a 25% price increase because the importers of the goods almost always pass the risen cost.
That's why they're in business.
Yeah, they pass the cost on to the customers. So Trump has stated that he's imposing higher tariffs or tariffs on high-tech goods that are imported from China. So this means that the cost of these high-tech goods is going to go up by 25%. So that could really hurt consumers, and it's going to hurt producers who import some of the inputs from China. So semiconductor companies in particular have complained that the cost of their doing business is going to rise a lot, because they get the parts and then they send them to China for processing, for putting everything together, which China does. It's one of the biggest processing centers in the world, in which they take the components from other countries and they put them all together and they export them out to the rest of the world. And so this is really going to raise the cost for those businesses, as well as for Chinese companies that are exporting their goods to the U.S. They're also going to take a big hit from that in their profits.
Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to look at this picture from a consumer standpoint. If my assumption was correct that the cost of consumer goods is going to raise by 25% at least, is that the same thing to say that their paycheck going to shrink by 25%?
Well, that's assuming that they spend their whole paycheck on consumer goods, which, a lot of that's a really good point too, because a lot of the poorer consumers actually do spend most of their paycheck on consumer goods. And so, yes, that's right. That essentially means their income will go down by 25% in real terms, because the costs have gone way up for them.
Right. So what does it mean to the economy of this country?
That means that people just won't be able to afford to buy as much as they bought before, and that the economy is going to face a big contraction. So, people who consume more, especially the poorer and middle classes, will really face some hardships. And maybe the wealthier consumers may not face as big of a hardship, but the companies that they invest in will probably experience some decline in profit. So that could also be problematic for them.
So that means what? There's a high potential of economy downturn. It's going to be recession, or is it? Are we at that level yet? This is automatic.
Well, it'll take time to see all of this happen. So some of the goods have already been essentially ordered and perhaps, paid for in advance. But eventually, probably in the next quarter, we'll see some of the effects of this already happening. And the impact is going to be both on consumption, which is a big percentage of economic growth, or GDP, gross domestic product, as well as on investment. So we'll see probably a relatively large impact there.
Let's talk about what's going to happen, worst case scenario for China.
For China, China has been looking for a lot of other outlets, both for their exports as well as potentially for imports. And so, they've been relatively smart about it already. China has already stopped purchasing soybeans from the U.S. They did this even a month ago, more than a month ago. And so they started to import more of their soybeans from Russia, as well as from Brazil. And they've also tried to increase their exports of aluminum to Russia. And so China's, going around trying to find really quick new markets that they can import and export to, that they can trade with. But I think that, the $200 billion in tariffs that Trump has proposed is really going to hit China pretty hard. And although the amount of trade that they depend on for their economic growth, although that has declined over time and there's more domestic consumption and domestic demand, they're still going to take a big hit because trade comprises about 1/3 of their GDP. And a lot of the trade is carried out with the United States.
Mm-hmm. Is U.S. largest Chinese trade partners?
Yes.
Okay.
So the U.S. is the largest in terms of exports. And so, this is really going to be a negative thing for China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
We're talking about a huge portion of the amount that they trade.
Mm-hmm. What are the chances of, I really don't see any other choices from China's perspective of switching their economy from exporting to a domestic economy, like you mentioned. I know they're doing that. I don't know how fast they're doing that, and will they be able to really weather this hardship that you mentioned?
I mean, just from a kind of like idealistic standpoint, they shouldn't have to do that. The world was moving in a very free trade oriented direction before this happened. And most major economies are pretty dependent on trade because when we use trade, we find countries that specialize in particular types of production, right, and that demand certain types of goods more than others. And then we can focus on what we do best. And so the idea is that we're a global economy and we're going to open our borders. And China has really complied with the World Trade Organization in terms of trade, maybe not so much in terms of intellectual property protection, but they've definitely complied in terms of trade. And so now this is forcing them to move in the opposite direction, which it just does not make any sense from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But look at this picture from a national security standpoint. I mean, this is not necessarily a bad exercise for China, isn't it? I mean, if the next Trump is going to come along, if they don't learn from this lesson, they're going to go through the whole thing again.
I mean, they could, but that's also what Mao Zedong did in 1949. Uh-huh. He closed off the economy to the rest of the world so that China would not be harmed by any global powers, any other, potential colonial powers or imperialist right. powers. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of going back to that old system, which honestly just doesn't make any sense and doesn't help to prompt economic growth. We saw when China closed off that they had very little in terms of, resources, things, alternative types of products that they could purchase. And now maybe things are better, but certainly China, like most other countries that are part of the global economy, are heavily dependent on trade with other nations in terms of getting the inputs they need for production, as well as exporting, finished goods to them.
Mm-hmm. Based on your educated guess, what do you think this whole thing is how is this whole thing is going to end? It's gonna be concluded?
Well, I hope that it's concluded really soon. I hope that
because we only have until about the 6th of July. That's the deadline is set for the tariff to take place, right? So
right,
there's a couple of weeks away.
So honestly, I don't think that it seems like there's nothing in place in the United States that is going to stop these, ridiculous policies. Mm-hmm. But one would hope that the U.S. Congress would check our president's power and, try to stop him from imposing further tariffs. Mm-hmm. But if that doesn't work, then potentially he could be impeached. Possibly, I don't know, but that could take another year.
Yeah.
And the re-election cycle could take another couple years. So it's not really clear that anything is going to stop him in the short term.
Do you think this is going to hurt or help his midterm election?
I think it's really hard to say. Certainly, a lot of the U.S. population, especially in very pro-Republican states, has been galvanized by his anti-globalization stance, especially because Trump touts this as being very pro-worker, which it's actually not. It's actually going to result in job losses in the United States.
That's part of the point of my question.
Yeah. And so, I have met people who are very pro-Trump, and even though he is putting into place these practices, these policies that don't make any sense, they continue to stand up for him. And his approval rating is at about, I believe, 44% of the population approves of him. So in terms of the American voter, I'm not sure that I have a lot of faith in terms of people voting for somebody more reasonable, but that has yet to be seen. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was certainly surprised that President Trump became president, but there is that force in place. So maybe it'll change, maybe it won't. It's really hard to say at this point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would like to switch the conversation just a tad to another angle. I want to talk about this potential, or is really happening about, this is my guess, it's not my observation, about this thing called paradigm shift in the international trade practice. What is your take on that?
I think that there is a new trade paradigm because the U.S. is like the center of the world economy. And this is something that was set up after World War II, mm-hmm. That basically all the other countries, the European countries, which were the major powers at the time, were destroyed, and the U.S. became the major power. And this is actually something that I think Trump will change, that the U.S. will essentially lose its power. Because right now the United States has the power to run a trade deficit if it wants to, because other countries are willing to hold U.S. dollars in the form of treasury bonds or whatever, and they'll hold them ad infinitum, seemingly. Even during the global crisis, we saw a flight to U.S. treasury bonds. And the crisis started in the U.S. So that tells you the power that the U.S. has economically. And because of this, the U.S. can run a big trade deficit. And also because other countries like China are willing to hold U.S. debt in the form of treasury bonds. Mm-hmm. This means that the U.S. government can run up a large government debt. And because Donald Trump is trying to eliminate the deficits, this is actually going to undermine American economic power, which, maybe it's not such a bad thing for the rest of the world, but for the United States, it's going to be quite a shock in terms of a switch to other countries becoming the leaders of globalization, especially like China. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also really wild that President Trump has taken to insulting other former allies, people who we really consider allies, especially Canada. I mean, what has Canada done to, to insult anybody? But, we see President Trump calling the Canadian Prime Minister names and, just basically insulting everybody at the G7. And so he's already imposed tariffs on these other European countries, on Canada, on Mexico. And so in response, we saw the European Union decide to impose its own tariffs on about 2.8 billion euros of U.S. imports, which is not a huge amount, definitely compared to the amount that, is going on with China. But it's still significant, and it indicates that there's a major paradigm shift away from traditional U.S. allies and towards countries that we have not considered allies, like Russia, which Donald Trump wants to invite to be part of the G7, or it would be the G8 once again.